Okay, so I saw Obsessions and Backrooms 2 times, and I loved them so much. My brother loved Obsessions more than me, but I loved Backrooms more than Obsessions because Backrooms is a movie that personally hits all of my favorite interests, thoughts, curiosities, and personal horrors. And as a Gen Z viewer who's 24 years old, who has grew up on the internet, grew up on YouTube, to me, it seems that Hollywood, internet horror, and even literary horror is now split into two, right? First, we have obsessions being horror about or fear through the lens of desire, whereas Backrooms is fear through the lens of space. And there's gonna be multiple types of horror. I'm even gonna reference Japanese denpa visual novels and how that can be horror of technology, horror of the self, mental health horror, even visual novels like Sayano Uta, where even the creator distinct that horror in his work was through a poison antidote life, if that makes sense, where his work is kind of the human desires and filth and taboo manifested in a work of art that is poison to your real world lived experience. And yeah, I think about books like Blood Meridian. I think about YouTubers such as Wendigoon. I think about YouTubers who are focusing on describing the occult, 4chan, the dark web, and having video essays depicting, the conspiracy theory iceberg or what's it called? Internet folklore or American folklore or Chinese, Japanese folklore and all how those horrors intersect. But as someone who's living in the 21st century, 2026, it's interesting to see how horror has changed throughout the years, right? You get the first version of the early version of horror being, Nosferatu, even Frankenstein, even the Mummy, where horror is focused on the supernatural, mummies, fear of the unknown, fear of the unexplainable, ghosts and such. But then you get this breakout movie in the early 2000s known as The Blair Witch Project, and it's about found footage horror. I watched a video essay describing how The Blair Witch Project is a movie that probably could have only succeeded and come out at that time due to the fact that it was early 2000s, the internet was very new at that time, and people believed what they saw online. And through the publicity and the marketing tactics of this is real documentary footage of real people going through the woods, people watched the movie believing it was real, thus making the verisimilitude of that film extremely high. They believed it was true, and that's what made it scary. But now, as a Gen Z person, every culture, every decade, every new generation is imbued with their own fears and their own desires. And to watch Obsession to be a film centered around one man's desire of love, it's not surprising that it was a white straight man who was lonely and single, who pined after a woman who didn't like him and decided to make a wish for her to love him and thus disregarded all of her wants and needs and her personal autonomy in order to fulfill his wish and his desires. It seems very reminiscent of pseudo incel culture, pseudo rape culture in a sense, where you look at the movie and I've watched it twice and I'm like, damn, that girl did not consent to this. And you see Bear having sex with her and it's just like, damn, this woman is not enjoying it. It just comes off as grape. And there's a feminist lens you can take with Obsession, which I do think is valid. You can see Nikki as the penultimate victim, or you can see Bear as the villain, or you can see Bear as a naive young person who was too afraid to tell his feelings, which I can also see that perspective too. But at the end of the day, we know that Bear is the one who caused all of this to happen. And if it wasn't for Bear who made the decision, Nikki wouldn't have done the things she's done, one to herself, to other people, and lastly, I guess, to Bear himself. But he made the wish, he decided to stick with it, and he was unable to get over the fact that Nikki didn't see him as anything else other than a little brother. And then you get movies like my favorite, Backrooms, surrounding, the unknown, the mysterious, open, vast spaces, things that are unexplainable, things that break physics, reality. This reminds me of a sci-fi novel called Three Body Problem, a Chinese sci-fi novel that kind of goes through the same feelings of breaking physics breaking reality, showing us a world that we had no idea existed. The Backrooms are fundamentally a story about this man. The movie, not the internet focused thing, but those are two different things. The movie is focusing about a man who works at this furniture shop, and he goes in the basement and finds this underground vast space that is probably, who knows how big, maybe 30,000 square feet, maybe even more, that represents this office light setting. And it's interesting to see how Gen Z's fears and what the cultural zeitgeist now is consuming and loving, the fear of being trapped in a space that feels wrong, the other about wanting something so badly that the wanting itself and even the person desiring that becomes monstrous. And it's interesting to see how, one, Gen Z, we're a generation that's having the least amount of sex. We're one of the most lonely generations, even though we have highest use of social media and we're supposedly the most connected generation, because we can be. I'm not surprised that this movie is doing well. I'm not surprised that many people saw themselves as Bear or many people saw themselves as Nikki, because there's another perspective that we can see with the movie Obsession where it's a mental health BPD sort of allegory, right? Where Nikki's a woman who is obsessed with Bear to the point where she's neglecting her own needs and is dangerous not only to herself but also to the relationship, to Bear, to the relationship, right? Which I think is an interesting point of view as well. I think there's multiple ways you can see obsession, which is why it's good. But I think it's important for us to just talk about, what does the future look like for horror? What does the future look like when we're having young directors? Kirby Burger is 26 years old, right? Kane Parker is 20 years old. And these people were former internet creators, YouTubers, I believe. And I'm not surprised that the world in Hollywood is now being privy towards social media content, YouTubers, TikTokers, even probably Substack writers in the future, where their stories, their beliefs, what they desire, and the audience responding to that in a positive way is only going to increase that tenfold in the future. I think we live in a world where Gen Z is a uniquely scared and anxious generation due to the fact that we live in a world where we're hyper-connected to the pains and traumas of millions of people across the world. We lived in America where we saw the Jeffrey Epstein post and files. We live in a world where Donald Trump is the president. We live in a world where rights are being stripped from people. This is why The Handmaid's Tale is also doing so well, because Roe v. Wade, women's rights, it's scary, you know what I mean? And as someone who reads, the next movie that should be adapted quite easily should be Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. Oh, Parable of the Sower, my bad. That, I read the book, it was horrifically scary because it felt extremely real and very close to home. And that's why I mentioned the Blair Witch Project, because verisimilitude, which is the term of something that is written fictionally but is presented as fact or real or has a high amount of reality, right? So the verisimilitude of the Blair Witch Project makes it scary. The verisimilitude of Obsession makes it scary. The verisimilitude of Backrooms makes it scary. Or maybe, just maybe, if you go touch this wall, you can no-clip through it and enter a world in which is vast and beyond your imagination, right? Or Obsession, where maybe, just maybe, this wish you ask for can be your worst nightmare or cause harm among someone you deeply love. But moving on, the book Parable of the Sower, in my opinion, should be the next movie being made. We made a movie of The Long Walk with Stephen King. I watched that. That was good. Didn't think it was too scary, but I think we need to make a movie about Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. I'm going to give, once again, a reference and shout out to Black female authors, because if you guys took the time to read the book, you'll understand why it's so good and ripe for adaptation, especially considering Gen Z's personal sentiments, personal fears, and the fear of the world, the fear of the future, the economic fear, which is why we see a lot of people actually saying, oh, why is there a new Western resurgence of Japanese death games, right? You know, you think of Kaiji Ultimate Survivor, you think of Kakegurui, you think of Akagi, you think of Usogi, you think of gambling anime, you think of Squid Games, you know, you think of MrBeast games, and now MrBeast himself is kind of playing into this whole I'm a rich person with power who can make any person do whatever they want. I want because I will give them money if they stay in the circle for a week, and yeah, it's interesting. I think it's just very interesting, and I want to know why we haven't gotten an adaptation on Parable of the Sower, because it seems quite easy to do and quite intuitive. It's a book about a woman who's living in LA. I forget the town she lives in, but she's living in a world where, one, climate change has basically increased the price of basic goods, water, food. The price of shelter has gone up. People are living in towns that are walled off. So not only a wall across, let's say, Mexico and the United States, like Donald Trump wants to do, but a walled off neighborhood, a walled off suburbs, because other people are now drug addicts and they're looting, and children are walking the streets with no clothes, no parents. Nobody can get jobs. People with PhDs, people with PhDs can't get jobs. And the cost of living, the basic cost of living for living for 2 weeks, costs $2,000 to $4,000 for 2 weeks for the basic necessities, or just eating, water, and shelter. So imagine paying $8K a month to live a basic normal life, where multiple families are living in one home, multi-generations, 13 people living in a single home, people sharing homes, going back to family. Oh, my grandma owns a house, we can go live with her and go garden and go grow some rabbits and breed some rabbits to get some rabbit meat, and that's luxury there. And it's a world where, gun violence and drug abuse, and these people who take this drug that causes them to get these erotic, sensual sensations when watching something burn. So they're pyromaniacs burning down towns and homes, and you lose your home, you have nowhere to go because you can't get a new home, and you lost your garden, you lost your ability to get food, and there's no cars because gas costs too much money, so everyone's supposed to walk. And you read the book, you're like, damn, I don't really see any disabled people. What happened to them? What happened to people in wheelchairs and stuff? And it's just, they're gone. And it's a world where it's a dog-eat-dog world, where you're supposed to do whatever you can in your power to survive. And there's no one coming to save you. The government's not here to save you. The government's infighting, the two-party system, the right versus the left, and they're fighting over bullshit while the people are suffering in America, unable to even pay rent and afford their daily necessities, forced to garden and breed bunnies for a living. That's horrific. That's horrific. People who read the book Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Sower, how do you pronounce it, and they get crazy anxiety over it. And I know this is a video about Obsessions and Backrooms, but I'm just thinking about it right now, where Obsessions and Backrooms hit with the general public so much because of our current fears in society and in the world, fears around desire, fears around space. I think Parable of the Sower would be an amazing addition to this horror movie craze, because it combines the two. People have the desire not only for love and all these other things, but the desire to eat, the desire for shelter, the desire for safety. You think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. These are baseline, fundamental needs that the characters are living with uncertainty with, and how your neighbor can come and take your resources, or some random person can come burn your town down, and you're left with nothing, living with constant anxiety. Everyone's learning how to shoot a gun because you don't know who's going to come and try and take what's yours. And you're living in a space where the country doesn't care about you, the state doesn't care about you. The only people you have are your family, your friends, and your neighbors, and even that, you can't even trust them. And you live in a society where even being the most educated, having the most credentials and skills, doesn't guarantee you a job. And if it does guarantee you a job, it's not a livable wage. And that seems like the future of horror, let alone Gen Z horror. And that's why people always say Octavia Butler is a prophet, because she predicted so many things. Even in the story, there's a line that says, by a president, that he says, "Make America Great Again," which is extremely eerie. I think that'd be such an interesting rendition. And, in addition to this whole horror saga we're having in this hot girl horror summer, right? So yeah, what do you think about that? I think about what the future of horror looks like, especially with these two young directors. I think they're changing the game with horror, but I also think they're speaking towards a new crowd. They're speaking towards the common sentiments of people who are scared now. you know? I'm Gen Z, I'm 24, and I'm fearful of the world and of my future. I'm not sure how to have hope in a world where having a job is difficult to have. Education, having an education seems contentious, or, was it worth it? Was it worth spending all those years, all that money on student loans? It's a weird world. We live in a world where monsters are ruling the country with impunity, which I find horrific. And if Octavia Butler is right, which many people believe she will be, it's not going to look good for us. And while I'm Canadian and the story centered around Americans, we're not spared either. We are not spared either. And if the book has any realities or reflection of our real life, all I can say is learn your local vegetation, learn how to grow, learn how to shoot a gun, LOL, just kidding. But yeah, I think that'd actually do a good service for the people if they all decided to fund this movie, get like a nice black woman actor, maybe Ayo Edebiri in like a horror franchise. That'd be really cool. I would love her in that. She's from The Bear, Cindy from The Bear. And yeah. So yeah, that's my video. I'm just here to make a video. It was good. Thank you for watching. If you got this far, let me know what you guys think about horror. What do you guys think the future of horror looks like? Comment down below your favorite horror movies. I'm interested to see. I like more psychological horror, which is why I liked Backrooms more than Obsessions. Even though Backrooms I gave 5 stars, Obsession 5 out of 5 stars too. Great movies. I do recommend you guys to watch it. What do you guys think the future of horror looks like? Let me know. All right. Peace.